And now, without further ado, let's greet our guest of honor. Yes, welcome. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
I would like to just introduce you. During Dr. Kelly's keynote address, your microphones will be set on mute. Please add your questions to the chat window for review during the Q&A session following Dr. Kelly's presentation, as time allows. It's my great pleasure to introduce our LifeRing Annual Conference keynote speaker, Dr. John F. Kelly. Dr. Kelly has graciously volunteered his time to come and talk with us about the mechanics of behavior. This is a subject that should be deeply interesting to each and every one of us because it addresses the active elements or mechanisms of recovery and how people find their pathways to recovery. It is an honor to have Dr. Kelly join us today. Dr. Kelly is a renowned expert and founder and director of the Recovery Research Institute at Massachusetts General Hospital and a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He is the first endowed professor of addictive medicine at Harvard University. Dr. Kelly is a pivotal figure in the world of problematic substance use research. His studies, not just what goes wrong and how to stop addictive behavior, but also how people find their pathways and thrive in recovery. Dr. Kelly is no stranger to many of us here. In fact, I had someone email me privately and say, is Dr. Kelly really going to speak? And I said, yes, he is. And she said, he's fabulous. So Dr. Kelly, you already have a fan club here. Dr. Kelly has conducted extensive research on evidence-based treatment for addiction disorders. His extensive collaboration to reducing stigma associated with addiction and the advancement of recovery management is recognized and highly respected worldwide. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John F. Kelly. Dr. Kelly, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much. That's such a nice, warm welcome. I'm very honored to be with you, actually. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity and invitation. Really lovely to see everybody and to meet you. And I hope what I have to say here is helpful and informative for you all. Feel free to email me anytime. If you have questions about recovery or research or papers that you want me to send, I'm happy to do that. Our institute exists for that purpose, so please reach out. Very honored to be invited. Thank you. Now, Sue, just in terms of time, we've got. You want me to speak for like 30 minutes and have time for questions, or what are you thinking?
I'd like you to speak for as long as you want. I think we're here to hear you primarily. So questions and answers. Well, you just said we could email you. So however long you would like, Dr. Kelly.
Sure, yeah. Well, I have an hour, so till 1:30 my time. So
perfect. Thank you.
I'm up here on the East Coast. Yeah. So I'm happy to stick around and why don't I talk for a bit, and then I'd love to get some questions and see if I can answer them. If I can't, I'll make something up that sounds convincing. Let me share my screen. Oh, can I share my screen, Sue?
Yeah, you should be able to. Mark?
It's disabled at the moment.
Oh, just 1 second. I'll be able.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Yeah.
Mark, can you please fix that?
I believe
Here we
I
go.
just did.
Okay, perfect.
Great. Well, hopefully you can see that.
Perfect.
You'll see my screen and you can hear me okay. Yeah, so I was pitched a few different topics, and I'm happy to answer questions on any kind of aspects of addiction, but I thought I'd focus on kind of the mobilizers and mechanisms of behavior change as they pertain to mutual help organizations. Just because organizations like LifeRing are so crucial, are so vital to so many people in helping initiate and sustain these changes over time. And they're becoming increasingly valued as we learn more about their potential from a clinical and public health perspective. Just to kind of give you some context here, last year was a 50-year milestone since the declaration of the war on drugs. So 50 years ago, that declaration was made under Nixon. Some of you may remember. Now, what that did essentially was really create, I know we associate the war on drugs, that rhetoric, with a lot of harms done to people with alcohol and other drug use disorders, but also it was a concerted effort to try and address these endemic problems related to alcohol and other drugs at a federal level. And many things have come about as a result of that concerted focus, including greater recognition of research and the need to understand these disorders. And when we think about what we've learned, and this is kind of context and lead up to kind of mutual help and why that's important, but just to give you some context of what we've learned in the last 50 years that we didn't know 50 years ago. For example, in terms of etiology, that these disorders, alcohol and other drug use disorders, have a very strong genetic influence. About half the risk for addiction is conferred by genetics. We also have understood much more clearly about the neurobiological impact, how these substances affect changes in the brain. They produce and induce changes in the function and structure of the brain, which creates, of course, this impaired control over the impulse to use a substance despite harmful consequences, what we call addiction or a substance use disorder. We've learned about the epidemiology in terms of the risk factors, other risk factors in the population that can increase or decrease risk for these disorders, as well as the pathways into these disorders, through them, the clinical course, and out the other side in terms of treatment and mutual help. Now, one of the things where I think it's very important and where mutual help has become such a key player and has been for a long time is because of this. This is another thing that has been learned in the last 50 years as a result of the research produced by the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism and the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which has produced 90% of the world's research over the last 50 years and 90% of the world's knowledge on addiction of what we know. But one of the very important things is for people at the more severe end of the spectrum. Now, we do know that people have different levels of drug impairment, drug involvement. When I say drug, I mean alcohol as well, under that rubric. That people have different levels of impairment related to these disorders. Now, at the severe end, what we call addiction, people who are addicted, people who have impaired control over ability to regulate despite harmful consequences, the clinical course tends to be a long one. It tends to be a bumpy ride into recovery and can even be a bumpy ride in recovery, as highlighted in this graphic here. We know that it takes about 4 to 5 years after the onset of an alcohol or drug use disorder before people start to seek help. Now, part of that is just fear of discrimination. These disorders are very stigmatized. People feel there's something wrong with them, that they should be able to control it, and they find it themselves that they can't. They try and hide it. They don't want to admit it. They don't want to acknowledge it to themselves. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to seek help. There's things that we can do there, of course, to help. The middle part here, after people start seeking help, it takes about 8 years after people start initiating help seeking. That could include mutual help organizations or formal treatment. It takes about 4 or 5 episodes of formal treatment or mutual help exposure in about 8 years before they achieve that first year of remission, that first year of abstinence or no symptoms. So that's quite a long time. Now, most of those days are actually abstinent days, but on the first attempt, someone might get 3 months and have a relapse. On the second attempt, a few more months abstinent and then have a relapse. But it takes about 8 years in adults to achieve that first year of full sustained remission. What's also noteworthy on the right here is that after people achieve that milestone, that first year, that golden first year of remission, which is fantastic achievement in and of itself, it takes another 4 to 5 years of continuous remission before the risk of meeting criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder in the following year drops below 15%. Now, why is 15% significant? Because that's the annual risk in the general population for anybody meeting criteria for an alcohol or drug use disorder. So to be no more likely than anybody else in the general population of meeting criteria for an alcohol or drug use disorder in the following year, if you've already had it, takes about 5 years of continuous remission. So risk remains elevated for those initial years, even after that first year of remission and initial stabilization. So this is why we often talk about these disorders as chronic disorders or chronic diseases, or that they need ongoing recovery management and recovery monitoring typically. And for people who engage in some kind of recovery monitoring, recovery management activity, the chances of staying in remission and maintaining this course is higher. Now, why is that? Now, we've learned a lot neurophysiologically on the as a result of the impact of exposure to alcohol and other drugs. It changes the brain. It changes the neurophysiology, both through neuroadaptation and through neurotoxicity, because these substances cause cellular death, particularly alcohol and methamphetamine, but also these very radical brain changes that I'm sure you've all seen pictures of those, because we've been able to see inside the living brain, to look at through functional magnetic resonance images, to look at how the brain is actually functionally changed and also structurally changed as a result of chronic exposure. Now, when people stop using the substance, everything doesn't snap back to normal, right? It doesn't go back overnight, doesn't even go back in the first few weeks. There remains a residual deficit, a residual change, what they call post-acute factors or post-acute withdrawal. So these are the factors which linger for many months, even many years in early recovery, which of course help explain why it is that that first 5 years after initial remission still remains a little unstable for people. And there are two major aspects that underlie this propensity towards returning to substance use, is because there is massive increased sensitivity to stress early on in recovery when people abstain. And also there's a down-regulated capacity to experience normal levels of reward. And this is partly because of the exposure to these substances over and over again on the central nervous system. When you take those substances away, there's a kind of a rebound effect, particularly with sedatives like alcohol, that people get very stressed. They're very sensitive to stress in the early months and years of recovery. And that takes some readaptation, recalibration, and relearning and new coping to cope with that. So that people don't pick up again. The other thing is this down-regulated capacity to experience normal levels of reward. And this occurs because when we use a substance, when human beings use a substance which has an abnormally high level of reward, the brain will try and adapt. It will do its best to try and adapt to this abnormally high level. So it does that by essentially down-regulating the receptors into which those neurochemicals will fit in an attempt to try and adapt to it. Now, when you take away the substance, of course, is that those cells remain down-regulated for quite a while, depending on how long and how intensively you've been using alcohol or other drug. Those receptors take a while to rebound and recalibrate, but it does happen. We call this recovery, and this is what happens in the brain when people abstain. One way to kind of think about this, the way I think about it, is kind of creating the right conditions that are conducive and supportive for an organism to recover. Now, when you think about how different organisms that might suffer disease or disorder in the human sense, there's different things that can be done to facilitate the right environment. Think about plants. You know, when you think about putting a plant in the right environment, you can have two genetically identical plants that can be placed just a few feet apart, one in the kind of sunlight that it likes, on which it can thrive and flourish, and just a few feet away in the shade, it can actually dwindle, become diseased, and die. So it's the exact same organism, just depending on the type of environment in which it's placed can mean the difference between dying and thriving. And I always think of recovery and the kind of recovery support organizations that have arisen to support recovery, to create these conditions as a kind of a psychosynthesis. whereby there are a number of supportive and conducive social conditions, typically run by peers with lived experience, that create the right conditions in which the human organism can start to flourish and thrive and psychosynthesize. And of course, there's been an array of these organizations that have emerged over the last 100 years. The most prevalent by far have been recovery-oriented mutual help organizations. But look at all the other things that have really come about, really inspired by mutual aid organizations. Things like recovery coaching, recovery residences, recreational organizations like Phoenix that provide peers access to physical activity and physical exercise and recreation with peers with lived experience of recovery. Recovery community centers, again, populated by peers with lived experience, in which a number of different mutual support meetings occur and other activities. And then there's also been recovery support services placed in college settings to help people adjust to a college setting and find support, recovery-specific support in college settings, as well as recovery high schools. And as you can see here, there is a cadre of mutual help organizations, including, of course, LifeRing, which have emerged and grown and expanded. I was just so encouraged to hear that. Was it 580% increase during COVID? The people are hungry for recovery support that LifeRing supplies. Now, in terms of the science on mutual help organizations, as you know, by far the largest and oldest has been Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's a very mature literature, an experimental literature on AA itself. But I think we can look to what we've learned about AA and apply that same knowledge to other kinds of mutual help organizations, such as LifeRing. Now, what we've learned about Alcoholics Anonymous is, again, it's a peer support service, people with lived experience, has slight differences in terms of its philosophy and practices. But when patients are linked to these indigenous, ubiquitous recovery support services, which are accessible, flexible, available over the long term in the communities in which people live, they're able to sustain remission over the long term at a much higher rate when compared to patients who are not linked to, in this case, AA, and are just provided with something like CBT, for example, without a linkage to AA. And you can see the magnitude of the difference here in the yellow bars. This is the top level of evidence in the most rigorous kind of review you can do in science, showing this demonstrated benefit of linking patients, in this case to AA, showing 20 to 60% higher rates of remission over 3 years compared to patients who are randomly assigned to receive another kind of treatment like cognitive behavioral therapy. So think about that. Not only does it help sustain remission over time at a much higher rate, but it's also very cost effective because these organizations are free. In this analysis, when we looked at cost effectiveness studies, for example, linking patients to AA saves healthcare costs by about $10 to $15 billion a year. That's just healthcare savings in 2018 dollars, and improving remission rates by 20 to 60%. So this is a kind of a double positive in that people are not only doing better when we link them to these peer support services, but it also reduces the burden on the healthcare system. Now, of course, we've got strong evidence that AA works. Now, the question, the obvious thing is, well, not everybody wants to go to AA. That's why we're all here today, because not everybody wants to go to use AA. I always liken this to kind of fitness centers. The question I often ask people is, do fitness centers work to keep people fit? And I think the answer is, yeah. I put money on the fact that they do work to keep people fit, but of course you have to go, right? You've got to go to the fitness center, you've got to work out. You've got to work out regularly to get physically fit. You can't do it without that, but you got to apply it. Now, of course, fitness centers know this, and so what do? They don't just maybe in days, you know, in the 70s and 80s, you know, your average fitness center was basically a weight room where people would just go and pump weights. Now, there is 100 different types of classes. There's pools, there's courts, racket courts of all kinds. Why do they do that? Because they want to attract and engage people in their fitness center to help them start something that is appealing and attractive to them. Okay, so not everybody wants to go and work out at the weight room. And so that's why they supply all these other kinds of options for people to attract and engage. The same question here is for mutual help. Do mutual help organizations keep people fit for recovery? Yes, we've got very strong evidence that people who go and work out, as it were, in other words, try and practice those the practices that are recommended and do the things that are recommended in those mutual aid organizations, tend to do much better. The good news is now we have a variety of different menu options for recovery in the recovery gym, if you will. There are a number of different options that people can find and that's suitable, that's palatable for them, and hopefully utilize those that can help them kind of work out and become fit for recovery. And this has been a very important part of the development of recovery support services. Thank you, LifeRing. Thank you for all that you do, because you are one of these options that provide people who are looking for something that LifeRing is providing, that they can say, yeah, you know what, this suits me. This is something that I can get engaged in. And we do know, and when I tuned in here earlier, I know you were talking about the PAL study. So this is Sarah Zemore's work, looking at different, when people start to utilize one of these different options, they do as well as any other option. Again, it's about finding something that's going to work for you. And thankfully now we have this broader cadre of options, mutual help options, that people can select and find something that works for them, that can help them. And we know from this study, and there's going to be a lot more studies over the next 20 years that will be emerging, which I would put money on, that will be showing the same thing, that when people choose something that works for them, then they self-select into it, they're going to benefit. And this is really good news from a recovery standpoint, from a human standpoint, from a public health and clinical standpoint, because we have these options. So we know a lot, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about the efficacy, effectiveness of mutual aid. And of course, when you think about why these things can be very helpful, yeah, as I showed you, that 5-year course, that long-term elevated risk, even when people are initially detoxed and stabilized, is a rocky one. It's a bumpy one. It's fraught with all kinds of increased sensitivity to stress, down-regulated capacity to experience normal levels of reward. So a sunny day just doesn't seem as sunny. A good movie just doesn't seem as good as it once did. And people need support during that time. And there is incredible power in peers. It's this kind of highlighted recognition that really started with mutual help. People with that lived experience, conferring, giving support to one another, it has been so powerful in helping people to sustain change. And there are mobilizers and mechanisms of these changes. I like this model specified originally in the professional context by Irvin Yalom. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a professor at Stanford. But he was talking about professional group therapy theory here. But what he documented was a number of different, what he called therapeutic or curative factors operating in professional group therapy. And we've done studies now, multiple studies with mutual help participants, showing that they also feel the same kinds of therapeutic elements operating in their mutual help groups. And these are shown here. For example, universality, that's the sense that you've got something in common. You know, I don't feel so alone because there's other people here that have suffered the same thing, they're suffering the same thing, or have suffered the same thing. What a relief that is to know that I'm not alone. I'm not going through this alone. There are people on the other side of this, people who are in recovery, who are living successful lives. So that's a great feeling. And that latter part, that observable evidence through looking around the group meetings and saying, oh, this person seems to have their act together, creates hope. That installation of hope, which Yalom specified as being critically important as a mechanism of behavior change in group therapy theory. But you can see many others here, existential factors, that sense of meaning and purpose that the quote that was put up earlier, that's a renewed sense of meaning and purpose, that my own disorder, my own illness that I suffered from, I can turn that around and use that to help somebody else. And there's another one, altruism. Helping somebody else helps me. So the helper is helped in helping somebody else. And of course, this is the cornerstone of mutual help. And there are many other ones in terms of imparting technical skills, relapse coping skills, staying away from slippery people, that notion of skills building, catharsis, interpersonal learning, self-understanding, all of these things, cohesiveness, all of these things are operating, I would argue, in groups like LifeRing. And it'd be interesting to see what you all think in terms of your own experience of how these things may be operating in LifeRing and in your own recovery. When we look empirically at mutual aid, and again, this is research from Alcoholics Anonymous because that's been studied the most. But this is what we have good evidence for, good, solid scientific evidence for how AA confers benefit to help people stay in remission over time. And you can see here that even though AA itself and 12-step organizations themselves would espouse spirituality as being the cornerstone of recovery, a spiritual awakening, as they would frame it, that is a player. It's a player here in the mix, but it's not the most important one, according to the kinds of effects that are conferred by participation in peer support via AA. These are more commonplace, these mechanisms of social network changes, coping skills, motivation, self-efficacy, or the confidence in your ability to stay sober, stay in recovery under different conditions. For example, when you're faced with high social risks, where drugs and alcohol may be present, or when you're experiencing negative affect like depression or anxiety. It's also been shown to work by reducing impulsivity and craving. And I think one of the things that's so important for mutual help, and I know this is something that LifeRing documents on its website and its materials, is this notion of kind of constant reappraisal and reminders, kind of keeping those memories alive of what your life used to be like when you were actively using alcohol or other drugs. Because that constant reminder, of course, our memories tend to fade. Some things are suppressed that are somewhat aversive to remember. They're unpleasant to remember, but they can be very adaptive to remember, because that's the reason why people end up in mutual help groups or treatment, is because things weren't pretty, right? People don't go to LifeRing for fun because things are going well. People don't go to AA or treatment because things are going well. They're usually because things have taken a turn for the worse, sometimes in a very dramatic fashion. And so they need to seek help to pull themselves out of it and maintain that. So that recovery motivation, I think, is a key one in terms of that constant reminder, reappraisal, say, you know what, yeah, I've forgotten about that. I liked it. That's good for me to remember. It's healthy, it's adaptive to be reminded. And that's going to motivate me. That's a constant motivator, because motivation, if you track motivation over time, this is why we see a lot of relapse after treatment. People at the beginning of treatment or a mutual help episode or a change episode, motivation is very high. Yep, I'm really going to do it this time. I'm really motivated. I'm really going to make sure I stay on track. But then the motivation starts to fade as people start to feel better. Maybe they're forgiven by the people in the network and they're feeling the relief from that. There can be a tendency to regress and not do the things. It's a bit like stopping going to the gym. to use that metaphor. You know, people start to feel better. They're saying, oh, well, I've lost a little bit of weight. I'm feeling better. So, and they start to stop going to the gym. It's gradual, but then they can fall back into those old routines. And the same is true of addiction recovery. So there's a number now of these mechanisms, so-called mechanisms of behavior change that are occurring. Now, these are all the psychosocial ones and spiritual ones. And you can think of spirituality in a broader sense here as kind of meaning and purpose as well. People often think about spirituality as a way to reframe things, to reframe stress, not just as a pain in the ass, but rather something existential that spurs growth. I'm going to do something more positive. I'm going to do something that's more adaptive. And so that can be in a broader sense, not just in a deistic sense, but in a broader sense of meaning and purpose, and reframing helps people to reframe. Now, in terms of, I'll just go into, I was going to stop there just because that was about 25, 30 minutes, but I'll just talk a little bit, Sue, about the recovery just for a few minutes before we have some questions. Just a couple of minutes, I'd like to just kind of talk about the dynamic aspects of recovery. You know, obviously there are different stages or phases of recovery, and we're starting to try and delineate those phases of recovery. You know, what happens in the first 3 months, in the first 6 months, in the first year, in the first 5 years, in the first 10 years? What happens to people? How do they change? What are the risks and challenges at each stage or phase of development in recovery, as it were? And we've done a big national recovery study a few years back. We published many papers from this database now. But what I'm showing you here is kind of good news for people in recovery, is that because these are people in recovery who are experiencing these adaptive changes over time. What you see here is a 40-year horizon. So these are 2,000 people. These are nationally representative of the US population. And so this is how we got our estimate of recovery estimate from the national population of 22.5 million, which you might have heard President Biden mention in his State of the Union back in March. That was our data point from our national study when he mentioned that 23 million people in recovery. But what you see here is what you would hope and expect is this nice incline in positive things that happen to people: quality of life, functioning, self-esteem, happiness, so-called recovery capital or resources that people use to rebuild their life. All of those are going up, and more steeply in the first 5 years. You see that steeper incline in the first 5 years, again, mapping onto that 5-year high risk period. Remember that I was showing you earlier? That maps right onto that, that's where you see the highest risk. That's where people need to kind of get back on track. And there's a lot more kind of rebuilding going on in that first 5 years. And also the decline there is in psychological distress. So that nice sweeping red line coming down from the top is the amount of distress, or that, remember I was talking about that stress and the hypersensitivity stress early on. So that is declining nicely. And again, you see a steeper incline or decline in distress in the first 5 years, which starts to shallow off over time. Now, what's also interesting, if you look on the right-hand side here, is that it's not a simple, super smooth ride, unfortunately, in recovery, but rather a bumpy one. And this one just highlights some of those bumps in the road in recovery and things to look out for that we're starting to uncover dynamically as people sustain these changes over time. What you see here is the first 2 years. So here we're putting under the microscope, if you will, what happens to those same indices in the first 2 years of recovery. So the same things: quality of life, functioning, happiness, self-esteem. You notice after about the first 6 months, you see that drop. There's a drop there after the first 6 months of recovery. And I think what's happening there is after the initial kind of stabilization, convalescent period, where people might be getting treatment, mutual support, family support, a lot of pats on the back, encouragement. And then they think, well, Johnny's okay. You know, Johnny's all right. He's done 6 months now. He seems to be doing well. And Johnny himself says, you know what? Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. But then what happens is the smoke starts to clear, or the fog starts to clear, And then there's a reality, there's kind of a dawning of reality that may happen after those initial first few months, where the person starts to say, wow, they start to look around, they say, look what I've got to clear up. They look forwards and they say, look what I've got to make up. And those two thoughts that occur after that initial fog clears can be a daunting one that can lead to this drop in the second half of the first year. So again, this is uncovering who needs what, when, for how long, over what duration. And so we're starting to, I just wanted to kind of put this up to show you, you can have these slides. I'm happy to send you these slides if you want, or any of these papers. But just this kind of idea of recovery and recovery milestones and recovery curve that people are undergoing early in recovery and then later in recovery. And again, this is just an initial kind of curve, initial attempt at looking at these dynamic aspects of recovery over time. But we're starting to fill this in, we're starting to uncover with more research about how people are changing and what things are needed, what things are helpful for people at different phases of recovery. So with that, I'll stop sharing, Sue, and hand back to you. And I'm be happy and delighted to have a discussion and answer any questions that I can on this or other topics.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. That was amazing. And we're so glad to have you here. We did have a question come in from Michael. If we can allow questions to open up, Mark, we can allow people to ask questions.
People should be able to unmute if that's,
okay.
And chat is enabled.
Okay, great. Well, I'll just ask for him. We have someone ask if you would not mind defining, Dr. Kelly, what does recovery capital mean?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, sorry for using that without explaining it. Recovery capital, you can think of recovery capital as kind of the entire set of resources. You can think of recovery capital like a bank account, kind of recovery bank account in which you have all your resources that you can draw on to help you recover. So these could be social capital. In other words, your access to people that can support you in your recovery socially. Could be economic, could be a job, could be housing, the kind of the building materials that you might need to rebuild your life in recovery, instill hope for the future. That's what's meant by recovery capital, that broad set of resources that people can draw on, which will include social capital like LifeRing. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
I'm sure other people were wondering that too.
I was.
Yeah.
Anna.
Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Kelly, for your time today and for very, very informative. I was just curious, what, if any, personal relationship do you have to substance use disorder, or if not, what drew you to this particular area of research?
Yeah, well, I got into this field for personal reasons, but I've stayed in the field for and got drawn into this area of mutual aid and recovery support services. I think because it's a no-brainer to me in terms of when we understand how difficult it is for people to sustain change. These mutual help organizations, which are ubiquitous and freely available, are in need of research. I was initially interested in researching kind of dual diagnosis and looking at psychiatric comorbidities along with addiction in my early career. And then kind of a little bit by accident, got access to data that had this data in terms of mutual aid organizations. And so that's how I've gotten into the recovery space, really kind of been pulled in that direction. And also in recognizing the clinical course, as I mentioned, what we've learned over the last 50 years in terms of how difficult it is and what a bumpy ride it is for people to initiate and then maintain these changes over time. And mutual help organizations provide this, again, the flexible, accessible, low cost or no cost apart from voluntary contribution support in the communities in which people live. So this is why I think groups like LifeRing, other mutual aid organizations which have grown and expanded are so incredibly valuable, because they're such a good fit for this kind of disorder.
Thank you for your answer, Dr. Kelly.
Yeah.
Mike, you have your hand up?
Yes. Thank you for the keynote address. That was very nice, Dr. Kelly. So I had a question about all of the recovery timelines seem to be based on a counting days approach. How many days consecutively have you been sober? And for me, that's a personal bugaboo. How much do the bumps in the road where people have slips or relapses affect that counting of where the starting point is on those charts?
Yeah, well, I think that's really up to the individual, and your identification with whatever organization you're in that may be counting days or not. Those, individuals in our data set, in our national recovery data set, about half of those were abstinent, about half were not. So half of those individuals, even though they identified as resolving a significant drug or alcohol problem, were not completely abstinent. About half were, about half were not. Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the things, of course, and this is a kind of a debate going on right now. We have non-abstinent remission. We've had that, of course, for a long time. The idea of remission from a medical standpoint. Remission doesn't necessarily have to be abstinence. You can be in remission and still using at a low level, but it's just not interfering with your life and it's not causing problems. And we call this remission. Now, most remission is abstinent remission. It's a little bit more stable abstinent remission, as you might guess, just because you're not kindling, you're not exposing yourself to the substance which can increase craving and lead down a slippery slope. But not everybody does that. And some people may be using for a long time, having resolved a problem, but using at a low level or using a secondary substance that they were not using previously. In our national recovery study, in fact, we just published these data that people with who are in abstinent recovery have a little bit better functioning, a little bit better quality of life and functioning. And just neurophysiologically, of course, if the disorder in the brain is caused by exposure to these neurotoxins, then if you remove the poison, Mother Nature is going to be able to do her job better. And again, the toxicity, though, is in the dose. The toxicity is in the dose. So, even a little bit of cyanide won't do you any harm if it's small enough, even though it's a poison, right? But if you go up a little bit on that, you're going to die. So it's can you use, if you are using or engaging with the substance, can you keep it at a low, non-problematic, non-toxic level whereby you're not doing yourself any harm? But again, and here's the other thing in the National Recovery Study, Mike, that we found out is that over time, as people go on, maybe they're getting older, maybe they're just getting fed up, or maybe they're just getting bored. The substance use becomes not conducive with where they are in their life stage. As people go on in their life and in recovery, they tend to be more likely to become completely abstinent. That's the other thing as people go on. So those are some of the things we're finding. So I think any steps in the right direction where you're reducing harm to yourself, that's good news.
Thank you. Rafal.
Thank you for, nice to meet you outside YouTube. That's very nice. In the 3 slides that you showed towards the end of your presentation, you showed how the stress goes down while the quality of life and everything else goes up. Is there any research that shows which causes which? In other words, is it the psychological stress going down that improves our confidence, or is it the other way around? We become more confident and we become more self-assured and live healthier lives, and that's what brings the thing down.
That's a great question. Yeah, it'd be very interesting to look at that on a more fine-grained level, wouldn't it? To try and understand that.
Yeah.
We don't have that answer right now. Yeah, so, but that's hopefully something we'll be able to look at. You know, many of these things are reciprocal and simultaneous, aren't they? And we think about kind of instilling hope that, yes, you know, I can get better. What's happening in the brain there? You know, when I see other people, I say, well, you know, they're doing well. That maybe if I did what they did, I could get some of what they got. So that instills hope, and that can then I can see other people, and I say, well, that's boosts my confidence too. My confidence is improving because I can see these other people doing it. Maybe I can do it if I do the same thing. And if you show me how to do it, then those skills are gonna. And of course, all the time I'm not exposing my brain to toxins or high levels of toxins, then Mother Nature is doing her work to help the brain recover and you know, decrease those abnormally high levels of stress sensitivity and increase normal levels of reward. So the world is starting to look brighter, you know. So all of these things are all going on at the same time. So it's hard to parse out what's causing what or what leads to what, but there's got to be some kind of, you know, temporal resolution in there, a fine-grained resolution that's you know one thing leading to another. But that's something that will be really interesting to look at down the road, Rafael. Thanks for the great question.
Thank you, sir.
Casey, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Dr. Kelly. Great talk, very informative. Kind of a two-part question. First, is there any research that's being done to show any differences in what the particular substances, for example, would a person benefit from different resources if they were recovering from methamphetamine use disorder versus alcohol use disorder, or can they all kind of fit under one umbrella? And are there any benefits to seeking support through mutual help organization that particularly supports what your substance of choice is, or maybe it's better for something that like LifeRing that you know, people can show up from with a lot of different substance use disorder, and then also something that's behavioral or like a so-called process addiction like shopping or sex addiction. Would those fit into what's being researched here, or is that something that's researched separately?
Great question. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've thought about that. And of course, phenomenologically, historically, people have, initially anyway, with 12-step organizations, of course, they created very specific, drug-specific organizations with alcohol, then narcotics, which of course was principally opioids, but it became, you know, all-inclusive. But then you had Cocaine Anonymous and Crystal Meth Anonymous. And, you know, that is a question. I don't know, you know, other than, you know, we can't really randomize people to see which one would produce the best benefit, but rather, again, people are self-selecting into organizations and groups where they may need that kind of level of identification, perhaps initially. You know, there's a lot going through my mind in answer to your question. One of the things I've thought about as well is when we look at psychiatric disorders in general, so you look across the whole spectrum of psychiatric disorders, including substance use disorder, which of course is a psychiatric disorder as well. And you look across, you know, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, psychotic spectrum disorders, and substance use disorders, those four broad categories. What's interesting historically, and again, not for everybody, but again, for people on the more severe end of the spectrum, what we see is a tendency for people with these types of disorders to find a path out through this connection with other peers, with other people. Now, Johan Hari said, you know, the opposite of addiction is not abstinence, the opposite of addiction is connection. Now, there's something to that. When you look across, you know, why is it, for example, that major depressive disorder why don't they all migrate? We all know that, you know, being with other people helps us feel better. People with mood disorders are going to likely benefit from being together with other people, but the pathway out historically, phenomenologically, people with anxiety or mood, or they haven't tended to move together and group together to find a path out, whereas in addiction, they have. So there's something going on here, I think, with addiction, broadly speaking, that is conducive to this social interaction. Now, we do know from a neuroscience perspective that increased exposure to other people actually upregulates these downregulated dopamine receptors. So that is a kind of a truism in the sense that when you're all together, you are naturally upregulating as primates. Those dopamine receptors are starting to increase. When you remove the toxin and you're with other people, as primates, you tend to get rewarded for that. Oxytocin gets released, vasopressin. It tends to help us buffer stress, the other major dimension of relapse risk, and improve our capacity to experience normal level of reward. So broadly speaking, sorry for the long-winded answer, but broadly speaking, across the spectrum of psychiatric illnesses, this one in particular, the substance use disorders, impulse control, kind of tend to respond very well to these social engagement factors, and we're finding there's a neuroscience underpinning that. You know, the other thought I had, Casey, is it? Casey, just quickly, is that one of the other things that we have learned is that kind of birds of a feather flock together initially, but over time, you start to realize that you have more commonalities than met the eye at first. So, for example, when we look at young people in mutual aid societies, in AA and NA, for example, where we've looked, young people are more likely to go and do well when there are other young people in the meetings. So they go and they see other young people. Now, here's the other thing though. So at first they do better. So they have more abstinent days, more recovery early on. But if they continue to go to those young persons meetings a year later, they're doing worse if they're going to exclusively young people's meetings. So there's something to be said for that initial kind of attraction and engagement. The similarity may be good for initial attraction and engagement, but after a while, for young people anyway, they need exposure to perhaps a broader range of recovery experiences than is available just among young people. So they need kind of more of that expansive recovery. And the people who do that tend to do better over time. I guess that makes me think of this notion of kind of the specificity of identification with a particular drug and drug experience. May be good for initial identification, but then over time you realize that there's more commonalities than there is differences across these different substances. That makes sense?
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thanks for the question.
Lorraine, would you like to ask Dr. Kelly a question? You're on mute.
I thought you were on mute. Okay, so thank you, Sue, and thank you, Dr. Kelly. It was very interesting, particularly the markers of 5 years and 6 months. I found that really interesting. And my question is that I've always felt that lifelong secular recovery is a too well-kept secret. You mentioned the spiritual aspect of the 12-step model, and I think that is our differentiator, but I'm curious how you learned of LifeRing and how at 25 years, can we best share the message of LifeRing secular recovery to people who need it?
Well, that's a good question. I think one of the things that will help LifeRing is actually people studying it more, getting to know it. That's one aspect of it. So, and I think, you know, kudos to Sarah Zemore in doing her study, which included LifeRing members. That's very important. That's a very important data point, because what it really highlights and shows is that when people choose something that is appealing and engaging, just like that gym analogy, they choose something where they can go and it's a good fit, they tend to do well. It's not a matter of relative efficacy, but rather finding something that works for you. What we're going to see, Lorraine, in answer to your question, what I would anticipate is that over the next 20 years, it's been kind of dominated by the 12-step landscape, because that's been by far the biggest. But we're trying to expand, broaden the base of menu options from a public health standpoint for these reasons I'm outlining, so that people have more things to choose from. Just like at the gym, you don't go to the gym, there's just a weight room. I'm sorry, the only way you're going to keep fit is by going to the weight room. Well, I don't want to go to the weight room. Well, I'm sorry, because that's the only thing we got. But rather, we've got yoga classes, we've got all kinds of Zumba classes, we've got courts, we've got pools, we've got all kinds of things. That's what we need and have needed for mutual help as well. LifeRing is a very important one. It's one of the ones that people talk about. They'll talk about smart recovery, LifeRing, women for sobriety. These are ones that have been around for a little bit and have gotten some traction and staying power. And staying power and growth, again, are two indices that provide observational evidence that there's something to these things. Some things are just, they come and go. Other things stick around for a reason. There's a reason why they stick around, is because there's something to them, and there's gravitas there, and there's people that find value in them, and that's good news. So I think, people like myself, I try to, I've got a bit of a platform, you might say, in terms of what I can communicate. So I try and communicate what I'm communicating here, that we can expand the menu of options. We need to expand the menu of options. We need more research on LifeRing, on smart recovery, on these other things. We're doing a big study right now, for example, on smart recovery, an NIH-funded study. We have 500 people followed up over 2 years looking at smart recovery. That would be good to do with LifeRing too, to look at the LifeRing experience of engagement and retention and benefit. The way that we've looked at AA and other groups, we want to look at LifeRing. Again, as you start to get publications out, that gets press releases, that gets it into the media, that gets more people aware of what LifeRing is and does and how people can benefit. So, so I would anticipate, though, that if you all stick around and keep this going, it's just going to get better. It's going to expand more. People are going to be more engaged with it. People will find out more about it. People like me will do studies on it with your help, and we'll be able to kind of get it out there, because obviously it's helping people. Obviously, evidently it's helping people. So we just need to document that and get that out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Kelly, I would very much like to encourage you to do a study on us. We would be more than happy to help. Mark, you have your hand up?
I do. I have 2 questions from Mark's. I think mine is shorter, and the other one is from the text, and I'll just read that out loud when I get to it. But the first one is, you say after 5 years that the probability of remission is the same as the probability of initial lapsing. I believe I've heard that. And so my question is, basically, is that because the person that could relapse has now gained particular skills and actions that make it improbable that they would relapse, versus the general population doesn't need to have those skills anyway, right? Is that it's not a problem for them at all? Or is it that they've actually gotten to the point where they don't even really need to be skilled at it? It's like wearing suntan lotion. If you're susceptible to the sun, is different than if you just aren't susceptible. So that's a question from first Mark, which is me.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, no, I think, again, those are statistical averages. The exact nature of what's going on, we don't know for sure, but you alluded to what was going on quite well, I think, Mark. In terms of, we know that the statistical risk of meeting criteria for an alcohol drug use disorder after 5 years is no higher than the general population. That's what that is saying. Now, the reason why that is true, given the history that's gone on inside that organism, the human organism, is because there's been kind of processes of deconditioning if you understand classical conditioning. So there's these deconditioning processes. So you're no longer triggered by people, places, and things, or exposure to the substance. But so when you see a drink, if you're addicted to alcohol, you see it doesn't produce that same level of activity in the brain that produces craving, because there's deconditioning that's gone on. There's also skills training. Even if you did have some of that, you would override it, because there's new capacity in the prefrontal cortex, which has happened once you remove the toxin. So there's greater skills that have occurred. Also, what happens, of course, is that people create a lifestyle that's conducive and supportive to ongoing recovery. So they're not going and hanging out with drug dealers in bars. They actually have a lifestyle that's actually devoid, typically, of those kinds of things. So it makes it easier to just live your life and not have to be, tempted. So I think there's those things that go on from a process perspective that helps people lower that risk over time. Again, it's not zero. We're also doing a study on long-term relapse risk. So we're looking at people who have been in remission for 1 year or more, and then we're looking at the people who've relapsed after that initial remission to understand what the phenomenology is there. So stay tuned. We'll know more about that on the other side of it. But that's what I think is going on there, Mark.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. And then this is from Mark T. And so I'm going to try to describe it from it. Is basically, what does the turmoil of early recovery, like this risk of relapse, I guess, say about the horizon of commitment to the point at which you should be a mentor to mentorship? LifeRing sets convener entry at actually 6 months of sobriety to be a convener. AA guidance is different. And I guess this is two aspects, is sponsorship effective if there's a chance that somebody would relapse? And then what would the range be should you actually go for this stability after approximately 5 years before you could really even mentor somebody else, sponsor somebody? And if Mark T, if I got it wrong, please text it out.
Well, I can speak to kind of what we talk about in recovery coaching. People generally talk about a 2 year, 2 years in remission or 2 year period of recovery to be a recovery coach. I'm not sure where they get the 2 years from. It's somewhat arbitrary. But if you look back in the history of mutual aid, of course, you look back to the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous, it was born out of desperation. They didn't have the luxury of waiting 6 months before they could go and help somebody else, right? They had to go and help somebody else. Now, probably what happens is that when you're helping somebody else, again, you're recounting what happened to you. Oftentimes, you're expressing your own experience. That helps to, number one, remind you of what you're about, what's important, what's salient, but also, it also boosts self-esteem, I think, and kind of the sense of like, you can do something positive, and you can feel good about that. So I think those two therapeutic elements are going on when people help. As to, when you would be officially designated as a convener or a sponsor capable of helping, I think probably some minimal level of stability and sure-footedness would be advisable if you have the luxury of that. Of course, in the early days, those people did not have the luxury of waiting. They found a way to help themselves by helping somebody else. And that probably helped them just remember what it was like for them, and also help them feel good about themselves. And also just a matter of occupation. So, just occupying your mind with something that's positive, constructive, as opposed to letting it, migrate back to romanticizing picking up a drink or a drug again.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Dr. Kelly, we have gone past your time, and
Yeah.
I am very happy to have you stay, but I know you also have other obligations, so.
Yeah, I do so, yeah. No, but
Okay.
I'm sorry I have to leave, because I just enjoyed so much, so have me back again.
Oh my
for-
goodness, tomorrow. Tomorrow.
I'd be delighted to come back and talk with you again and answer questions, and if I can, the best I can. And just such a pleasure, honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for, let's try and, see if we can do some research. It'd be lovely to do that and put it on the radar more squarely. So thank you again, everybody. And thank you for all that you do to help so many people, help each other, of course, but to help so many other people providing this option. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your time and your generous
Oh, yeah.
your time.
Absolutely, my honor and pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For
right.
those people who would like to learn more about or read more about Dr. Kelly's writings, I'm going to put his publications in the chat window. And man, that was great, wasn't it? I was very inspired. I wanted to tell him all about it, but he needed to go. And thank you guys for bringing forward such awesome questions. That was an exciting and incredibly, I don't know, the whole trajectory thing was kind of, I'd love to maybe talk about that in another meeting at some point.